Thank you for joining us today for our next webinar that is sponsored by the U.S. Aquaculture Society, the National Aquaculture Association, and the Alabama Cooperative Extension System. Today we've got Dr. Ben Halpern with the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management out in California, who's going to talk to us today about the environmental footprint of global food production. And Ben, you can do a better introduction of yourself than I can. If you would, just give folks a little bit of background about you and the Environmental Science Center, and we will go ahead and get started.
Okay, thanks so much, Dave, and everyone for joining today. My name is Ben Halpern. I'm, as I said, a professor at the Bren School at UC Santa Barbara. I'm also the director of the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, or NCES. And my background is in kind of marine ecology and marine conservation, but I got into fisheries and aquaculture work maybe almost 15 years ago. I've done a lot of work in the last decade, exploring kind of the environmental and ecological challenges and opportunities and intersections with aquaculture and other uses of the ocean. And that led me to a lot of this work on kind of understanding how aquaculture fits into the broader food production system. So I'm excited to share the work that we have done. This is work that's published, but I'll end telling you kind of where we're headed in next phases with this work, because it's an ongoing project. So I am excited to share what has been a team effort with a lot of folks involved in a group here hosted by NCES that I led, that has pulled together a lot of information about how food production across different systems affects the environment. And I got into this work in part because I was interested in aquaculture and how it fit in to the broader food landscape, but also because I was really motivated by this question of like what I should be eating to be kind of environmentally friendly. And almost a decade ago, I decided to become pescatarian because of the news kind of around how a lot of livestock meat the production of that is bad for the environment, especially with greenhouse gas emissions. But I'd never really tested that idea. And when I went to look into the scientific literature, there's lots of scattered information, but nothing really pulled together, at least in a way that I was looking for, to understand how things kind of compared to each other and what that might mean for how I could adjust my diet to be as environmentally sustainable as possible. So this simple question ended up leading a very long path, years of work with lots of folks involved to try to answer that. Now, this background information is probably pretty familiar to a lot of you, but I'll help set the stage for kind of the kinds of information and the way that we were framing the question when trying to answer that. So as you probably know, a lot of fresh water is used for aquaculture, primarily crops, a little bit for livestock. So 70% of our fresh water is used to grow food. Food production is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. A third of all greenhouse gas emissions comes from food production, and most of that is from the land use, land change, and production side of growing food. It uses a lot of land, either for crops or for pasture lands. 40% of our arable land on the planet has been converted into food production, taking it out of kind of use for other purposes. And of course, beyond these kind of broad environmental potential consequences of food production, a lot of the questions I was trying to answer were in the comparative space, like how do they compare to each other? So I'm guessing many of you are familiar with this kind of information as well. One of the main critiques of fed livestock and aquaculture is that you have to convert food that could otherwise be used by humans to eat into the flesh of the animals. And these conversion ratios vary amongst different animals, with beef and cattle being the worst, and actually farmed raised fish being one of the better ones. And information like this was kind of one of the key motivations for trying to dive deeper into this, because you can, when you have these kinds of comparisons, it helps you basically compare apples to oranges, or in this case, livestock to wild fish and farmed fish. when I dug around looking in the literature, what my team here did, there was some work that had been done, and I'm going to just set the stage showing a few of these studies that kind of have done this kind of comparison. One of the earlier ones was this one in Nature by Tillman and Clark that looked at greenhouse gas emissions from food production. And you can see, the livestock meat and the fish from aquaculture and wild-caught fisheries have pretty high greenhouse gas emissions per gram of protein. And so this comparison, obviously points to, if you're focused on greenhouse gas emissions, maybe a vegetarian diet, eating more of the crops. A few years after that, Poor and Nemechek in Science released a study that got a ton of news coverage, so maybe you also saw this. And they looked at greenhouse gas emissions, land use, acidification, eutrophication, and water, freshwater use across a whole bunch of food products that you see along the vertical axis there. So livestock on the top, fish and other meat and nuts in the middle, milk, and then some other crops at the bottom. And I'm going to just show you, not for you to need to digest any of it, but they had tons of data that they took from life cycle assessment studies that looked at the relative footprint of these different food production systems against these different measures. But what really stood out to me in this study is that there was very little on aquaculture, let alone seafood, in this study. So it was a really comprehensive study that got lots of attention, but it really mostly covered livestock and crops, and how seafood fit into that was pretty limited. And as you can see, all fish were lumped together and all crustaceans were lumped together, which is not a very useful dissection of the different food systems. And then lastly, there's a study by Ray Halpern and others that came out that same year trying to compare farmed and wild fish to a few of the livestock. So this starts to get a little bit deeper into different types of seafood, but of course it didn't have any of the crops there. So interesting pieces, but it wasn't all stitched together. And this is what motivated trying to kind of do this for food production systems around the world. One more context setting piece that we published, a year after those studies came out, that was making the case for why we need to put all, these foods on the same table when trying to do comparative assessments of sustainability. And we looked at hundreds of studies, and this figure on the right shows the different measures. So acidification, biodiversity impacts, energy use, eutrophication, freshwater use, greenhouse gases, and land use across a whole bunch of different foods. Those are stacked up along the vertical axis. And what you can see pretty easily is that most of them have not been studied at all. The vast majority of studies have looked at just greenhouse gas emissions. But these other measures are very, very infrequently assessed. And similarly, at the top, you can see that the mariculture and fisheries and aquaculture food production systems have been very lightly studied as well. So clearly, there's a gap in this literature of how these different ways that you can measure the environmental footprint of food production exist, and how little has been included seafood in the comparison across all these different food systems. And this matters a lot, especially for many countries around the world where seafood is a dominant part of their food production systems. So a lot of island nations or coastal countries in Africa, Oceania, and the Caribbean, as well as many European countries, have seafood as a dominant part of their food production system. So if we really want to understand the environmental footprint of food across the world, across all countries, we really need to include all of these different food systems to create a comprehensive assessment. So that's what motivated all this work, and what we saw as missing really was kind of a comprehensive and comparable measure of all of these different stressors that come from food production systems, not just greenhouse gas emissions, not just crops, for example. And importantly, how do you pull that together into a cumulative pressure measure, so that you're not looking at each piece individually, but collectively, how do they all add up, so that you have the full picture of how food production is creating an environmental footprint on our planet. And then critically, the map of where these pressures actually are. So all of those studies before were done through life cycle assessment comparisons that don't actually map where the food is being produced. They just take the results from different studies and combine them into those metrics that you saw, like the little graphs with means and error bars around them. And of course, the maps really then help tell you where that footprint is existing, where it's happening. And that can then be used to think about strategies for mitigating or better managing how the food production is affecting our planet. In order to measure the cumulative pressure from multiple stressors, we needed to develop some new methods, which I'm going to just briefly describe to help set the stage for what we did. So we needed to combine life cycle assessments, sort of the standard way that any product, food or otherwise, is measured to determine like its total greenhouse gas emissions or its total water use. That's what life cycle assessments do. And then impact assessments that I've done a lot of, where you can look at the cumulative impact of, for example, human activities on marine biodiversity. And so we needed to look at how these compare and combine so that we could come up with a single way of assessing the total environmental footprint of food production. So to do so, you look at the various food types. You've got agricultural crops and the feed components, livestock, fisheries, and aquaculture, and all the different products within that. So you can look at those food types. And then you look at the activity that's coming from that. So you're fertilizing the land, or you're irrigating it, you're feeding the livestock, or of course the harvest, like for fisheries, has an environmental footprint associated with it. Each of those and we did not look at food transport in our study. It's a relatively small portion of the total environmental footprint. And so we just left it out. It's a very complicated one to track and map. But from each of those activities, you can determine pressure. So in the kind of cumulative impact approach to measuring things, these are called pressures. In the life cycle assessment approach, these are called life cycle inventories. You're looking at the nitrogen emissions or the water use or the greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the pressures that come from these activities. And then those create pathways of potential impact. So you can get nutrient pollution or aquifer depletion, climate warming, ocean acidification. So in the cumulative impact measure, these are the pathways towards impact. And for life cycle impact assessments, these are the midpoint impact categories. And then ultimately, you can look at the sensitivity or the impact characterization of those pathways on the place of interest. And then that will tell you the impact that you have on the land or in the water. So there are parallel processes or methods. So we were able to combine these to come up with sort of a unified approach to thinking about the data that comes from life cycle assessments and the mapping methodology that we've developed for cumulative impact assessment, to combine all this together to come up with a single approach. So implicit in this combination, and what differs from just sort of classic standard life cycle assessment approaches, is that we needed to and could account for where production occurs. And then importantly, we account for the volume of production. So life cycle assessment is always measured in like per kilogram or per pound or unit of measures, but they don't sum it all up to tell you the total consequence of all of that food production system. So we were able to look at that as well. When we launched this project a few years ago, there were no data, at least comprehensively, on where aquaculture existed in the ocean. And we need those location data in order to map where the footprint of that food production is. We had data on fisheries where those occur, and we had tons of data on livestock and crops productions from other people's work. But we didn't have information on where aquaculture was located. So we ended up needing to first do that, and that led to this publication where we were able to map the location of nearly 100,000 farms worldwide. Many of these were known locations, the green spots. Others were known locations, but not the exact place within those. We knew how many farms there were, but not exact locations. So we needed to model the distribution of those farms within sort of a province or territory. And then others, we knew the amount of production, but we didn't have specific information on the location or the number of farms. So we used information to estimate that. So it's a model, it's imperfect, but including all the available location data that were available at that time. And this then created a map we could use to distribute the environmental footprint of aquaculture. Okay, that's all the context setting stuff. Now we get into the meat of it, so to speak, of the analysis that we did. And I want to show you the kinds of data that were brought to bear on all this, and then I'll turn to the maps and the results that come from that. So we looked at all livestock, aquaculture, crops, and fisheries that we could get information on, and all of the different aspects of those food production systems that would produce environmental outcomes. So for livestock, you have manure, feed, land use, water consumption, and the enteric fermentation that leads to climate change gases, greenhouse gases. And we do that for each of the food systems. And so each of those sort of attributes of the food systems leads to different types of pressure. So almost all of them have greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. Some of them have a disturbance dimension to them, so the land use or ocean use area. Whereas nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, like for example, wild-caught fisheries doesn't have any, nor does wild-caught fisheries have any water use because they're a wild species that we're harvesting. Whereas aquaculture, if you have fed aquaculture, it uses water, but unfed aquaculture would not, for example. So we were able to track each of these 4 key types of pressures that come from food production systems and the attributes of them. And then we could sum that up into a cumulative pressure that we could then distribute and look onto the landscape to come up with a cumulative footprint. And we could identify high pressure locations or low pressure locations. And then we could also look at the contribution of different foods and their production to the overall cumulative footprint. So you can identify which food production systems are really driving the environmental footprint in any given location. What we did not do in this study is take it to the impacts of environmental change. And I'll talk more about that at the end of the talk. Across all this, we were able to include 99% of all reported global food production systems. We do not have like backyard farms or highly artisanal scale food production systems that doesn't get reported up into things like FAO or national statistics. So it's most everything, but not everything, obviously. So this is what we have. These are maps of disturbance. So this is conversion of land into food production systems. The darker the color, the more conversion there has been. And so you can see, maybe not surprisingly, the Great Plains in the United States, India, China, a lot of Europe, much of Brazil. These are areas that have had a lot of land conversion for food production systems. Nutrient pollution has similar patterns, but much more extensive across the landscape. A lot of animal, livestock, and crops fertilizers produce a lot of nutrient pollution. You can see it's pretty widespread across many parts of the planet. Water use is similarly widespread and distributed, but again has high concentrations in India, China, Europe, and the Great Plains of North America. And then greenhouse gas emissions, widespread again, a bit like one of the previous plots, just you're seeing it in most areas where you have livestock and crops production happening. It's very faint in here, but there are fisheries included in here, as well as aquaculture, obviously. The very light pink that you can barely see across the ocean is where kind of greenhouse gas emissions from wild-caught fisheries, the diesel ships that go out and catch the fish, are emitting. And so this is a comprehensive map, but obviously you can see the most intense pressures are coming from land-based food production. So we sum it all up, and this is where you can see the ocean pop out a bit more. This is the cumulative pressure, so the sum of each of these 4 types of pressures. And the red areas are the top 1%, the highest cumulative pressure areas across the planet. There's almost none of these in the ocean, as you can see, almost entirely on the land in Indonesia, China, India, across Russia, Europe, Great Plains of North America, and scattered across South America. So you can see it's highly variable spatially on land, but also across the ocean. And this gives us our first glimpse into sort of where different food systems are having the greatest cumulative pressure, environmental pressure on the planet. Key results that came out of this that we can start to, answer, questions we can answer because we've pulled this all together. So 90% of all global pressure is on the land. Maybe that's not surprising because that's where we live and that's where most food production occurs, but it's still important to be able to quantify that. The top 1%, those red areas, create almost 40% of the total pressure. So it's highly concentrated in those top 1% areas. Which means, if you were able to mitigate those pressures, you could have in those places, you could have a substantial benefit to overall global cumulative pressure from food production systems. Only 1% of those red pixels are in the ocean, so very, very few in the ocean, as I said. The top 10%, so the red areas plus the dark brown ones, are nearly all of the total pressure. So it's a highly skewed distribution. You see a lot of light yellow and kind of orangish colors across the entire planet, but those are really low cumulative pressure areas. The vast majority of it is highly concentrated in just the top 10% of these pixels on the planet. And you probably know this, but other folks I've talked to don't. Aquaculture has a land footprint because of the feed. So we get a lot of feed components from crops. And so hidden underneath these maps is the land footprint from aquaculture. But of course, we also feed forage fish and other marine products to livestock. So livestock have a marine footprint. And so being able to map these distributions of these pressures helps us start to understand the connections across the land and seascape and how food production can have a highly distributed spatial footprint across both land and sea. We wanted to look at where these top 1% locations are, these really high intensity areas, because if you can mitigate pressures in those areas, you can have kind of high bang for the buck return on investment for reducing overall global environmental footprint of food production. So I'm going to build up the different layers here. You can see on the bottom, the color codes talk about which type of pressure it is: disturbance, greenhouse gas emissions, nutrients, or freshwater use. And then we look at where they overlap, 2 times overlap. And then those that have 3 or 4 times overlap. So these are areas where these top 1% locations are single or multiple different pressures. I'm seeing questions pop up in the chat. It's hard for me to track those. So we'll have time at the end to answer questions. It's really hard for me to simultaneously read those and give a presentation. So add them there, but we can return to them at the end. So this is where the top 1% of freshwater use pixels are. India, China, Great Plains, Central Valley of California. You add in disturbance and see where those top 1% pixels are. They're many times not the places where the top freshwater use is. You can add in greenhouse gas emissions and then ultimately nutrients. So you can see, for example, in India and China, those dark gray areas, as well as some of the Great Plains, these are areas where all 4 of the pressure types have their top 1% locations. So efforts to mitigate environmental pressures from those locations would have substantial return on investment or bang for the buck for reducing global environmental footprint. And here you can kind of see a zoom into the Great Plains where you get areas, for example, those dark green are where disturbance and greenhouse gas overlap and so on. So these kinds of results allow you to identify strategically where you might want to act through reform or regulations or conservation strategies that would help mitigate pressures from food production systems. Because we mapped it, we can start asking which countries and which types of pressures and food production systems are driving those pressures. This is a lot in this figure, so I'll walk through slowly. We look at production by tons, by protein, and by calories, because these are 3 different ways that people look at food production systems and how to measure their efficiency and their environmental footprints. So those different shapes show the overall production levels measured by tons, protein, or calories. And so you can see we have the lighter colors are the four pressures in the ocean, and the darker colors are the four pressures on land. So if you look at India, for example, it's got a large dark blue band, and that's water use on land. The dark brown area is nutrient pollution on land, and that dark beige color is land disturbance, and the dark pink is greenhouse gas emissions. You can barely see the light colors in India because 95% of their environmental footprint comes from land-based food production systems, the dark colors. They're also the #1 country in terms of their environmental footprint. So these 15 countries account for 70% of the more than 70% of the global cumulative pressure. And the top 5 countries, India, China, United States, Brazil, and Pakistan, account for nearly half of all of the global environmental footprint on land and in the sea. So you can see that there's just sort of, again, there's a really high concentration, a high skew in the distribution of the environmental footprint of food production across these different measures. Like I said, you can also look at it by food type. So if we look at India again, the vast majority of their footprint comes from crops for human consumption, some ruminant meat, a little bit of pig meat, and then eggs. Those 4 are what look to be about 85–90% of their total environmental footprint. So you can disaggregate or lump and compare across many different ways of looking at these data. And we can do this because of the comprehensive way that we pull together information on all these pressures and then map them. And the mapping allows you to look at where things are happening. Another set of results that we could start to do, and this is where we finally return to the question that motivated this work for me, is how do foods rank against each other? How do you compare apples to oranges, livestock to seafood when trying to think about which food production systems have the largest or smallest environmental footprint? So here are the livestock, and again, we have the lighter colors are or I guess this is not land. This is when we look at livestock, it's direct, what comes directly from the animals, and then indirect or feed components. So we're able to track the footprint associated with the animals themselves and then the feed that is used for those animals. If it's crops, then they just obviously only have the direct measures. So you can see the different color bands here. And so for the livestock, you can see pig and cow meat top of the list. This is accounting for total production. So this is not per gram or per kilogram. We'll show those in a minute, but this is the total production. And basically we grow so many pigs globally, and they have a large environmental footprint that in sum, it's a huge total cumulative footprint on our planet. And most of that you can see for pigs anyway, is that light brown. It's nutrient pollution direct from the animals. And we know that pigs produce a lot of manure, and it's got a lot of nitrogen in it. So that's a dominant driver of their environmental footprint. Whereas for cows, the dominant pressure is from greenhouse gas emissions, the pink color there. So you can see that the total bar is the total cumulative environmental pressure from the food production. But the different components tell you which of the pressures are the main drivers of that total environmental footprint. So you can see how they stack up against each other with some of the milks at the bottom, mostly because they have lower total production volume. If we look at now at the seafood, and those dashed lines show how the vertical dashed lines and solid lines show how the x-axis adjusts. So we spread the scale on the seafood so that you can see the data better, but it means that they don't compare vertically as easily. And so, for example, demersal fisheries have a total cumulative pressure of 0.04. Well, that's less than pigs and cows and cow milk and chicken meat because of the shift in the x-axis. But you can see demersal fisheries are the largest of the fisheries from the disturbance of the seafloor and the greenhouse gas emissions from them. There's no feed components to fisheries because they're not fed, they're wild caught. Whereas mariculture, there's a bunch of fed species, and you can see that shrimp is the largest of those, but it's still less than demersal fisheries. So you can start to stack these up against each other. We looked at all the crops as well, and I'm going to stack these all in one slide in a minute, but you can see that rice and wheat top the list for the crops. They use a lot of water, they have a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and they just have huge production volumes. So that really drives their total environmental footprint on the planet. So this is what it looks like all stacked together. This is the figure that's in the paper. And it's dense now, it's really hard to see because of the small font. But basically, what you can take from this is they're stacked together. The top 5 food products are pig, cow, rice, wheat, and oil crops. And this again is in part because of the huge volume of production of these food systems. But it really, I think, changes the narrative a lot of, certainly for myself, but I think what a lot of people thought about sort of vegetarian diets versus non-vegetarian diets. Like there's a lot of the crops, because we grow so much of them, and they do have substantial environmental footprints to them, top the list. As I mentioned before, fisheries don't have water or nutrient pressures associated with them because they're wild stock. So their cumulative footprint is much smaller. 2 of the 4 that we measured just fall out. They're not part of the calculation for the cumulative pressures. And of course, crops and a lot of aquaculture are not fed, so they also have some of their pressures that drop out. So when you pull this all together, you start to think differently about how to compare things. You've got both production volume and cumulative pressures, not just single pressures, and you think about what's fed and not fed, and it really helps kind of reframe how you make these comparisons. So that thinking about cumulative pressures really tells a different story about how foods rank against each other. But I've alluded to this, and of course, one of the ways that most of the life cycle assessment studies focus on the efficiencies, the per kilogram or the per gram kind of assessment of food production systems. And because we've mapped this, we can actually answer these questions not just by food, which is what all those LCA studies have done in the past, but also by country. So what I'm going to show you is the efficiencies per food per country. And so what you see here, again, are the foods stacked up, livestock, fisheries, and mariculture. But each of those dots is a country. And I've color-coded the 6 of them just to kind of help visualize how they spread out. But also to show how you get huge variation among countries, and even individual countries change their rank order. So for example, if you look at India, the red dot, it's one of the higher environmental footprints for goat meat, one of the highest for cow's meat, but then for buffalo milk, it's one of the lowest. So it can bounce around. The relative rank order of any given country for any given food production system can change. Again, we can only do this because we were able to map where all these pressures exist and account for the cumulative pressures. Again, we've done this for crops as well. This is too tiny to see. But what you can draw from this is that crops and aquaculture are generally efficient. That's not news on the crop side, although it is maybe for folks who aren't aquaculture aficionados to kind of know that aquaculture is quite efficient in its food production systems. But you get, like I said, wide variation among countries. So you can have anywhere from 2.5 to nearly 9 times variation for any given crop across different countries. So just saying that rice is good or bad is not sufficient. It really depends on which country it's grown in to understand its environmental footprint. And for fisheries, it can be up to 22 times variation among countries. So it really points to the need to track not just what is being grown or harvested, but where it is being grown and harvested in order to understand the environmental footprint of the food production systems. So just as an example, soil production is nearly 3 times more efficient in the United States than it is in India. A lot of this has to do with the production systems in the United States that are, these giant monoculture crop systems with tractors and other mechanized ways of harvesting it that you can get a lot more production per acre per effort, and that creates more efficient systems. But you can also get variation among foods within countries. And so like a decision about what to eat based on environmental pressures, the rank order of foods can depend on what country you're in. So for example, in Indonesia, pigs are nearly 7 times less efficient than cows, really going against sort of the narrative about cows being the worst in terms of environmental pressures. So again, it really depends on which country you're in and how the food production system works in that country. The exciting part about this is that these differences create all sorts of interesting policy and trade opportunities. So you can focus on, the highest impact or pressure foods in a given country to mitigate, those to get the biggest return on investment. Or you might think about trade policies that help bring in food and support production in areas with the lowest environmental footprint rather than growing food in places where it has higher environmental footprint. So thinking strategically about, not just what is being grown, but where it's being grown or harvested is hopefully a really powerful tool to use to inform these kinds of policy and trade decisions. So that's where we left off, and that's published in this paper in Nature Sustainability from a few years ago. But we've continued this work across a number of threads, some which are starting to just come out and others that will be coming out in the coming year or two. But because we mapped where all the food production systems are going, we could then couple that with all the trade information about how food is moving across the planet to think about how consumers may be displacing their environmental footprints by importing food produced somewhere else. So tracking both production and consumption allows us to start to answer questions about basically who's paying the environmental cost for any particular food consumption pattern. And the hypothesis might be that wealthier countries export their environmental footprint by importing food from other places so that they don't have to pay the environmental cost. And that's a key question that we're looking at in that work, and we're nearly done with that, and we'll be able to share that out soon. And then the other thing we're working on is translating these footprints into actual impacts. So as I showed very briefly at the beginning, footprints are these pressures, but they don't tell you whether they're actually having an impact because different species and different ecosystems are more or less vulnerable to any particular pressure. So for example, nutrient input into coral reefs can be devastating because of algal growth and overgrowing the coral reefs, but nutrient input into, for example, a kelp forest might be a good thing because it actually can be used to grow the kelp. So how these pressures actually translate into impacts requires kind of another level of analysis to account for the different vulnerability and susceptibility of species and ecosystems to these pressures. So we have a lot of maps of where all these habitats and species are. We're coupling those with these maps of where the pressures are to translate environmental pressures into environmental impacts. And we'll be doing that for marine biodiversity and then ultimately for terrestrial biodiversity. So in the end, and to wrap up, like I returned to this question of what I should eat. And in fact, like I said at the beginning, I came at this as a pescatarian, someone who'd given up livestock meat because of the idea that it was less environmentally sustainable. This work mostly bore that out, but it showed that chicken was actually a highly efficient, low environmental footprint food system, especially compared to some of the kind of higher footprint aquaculture systems like shrimp. And so I've actually shifted my diet. I've added chicken back in, and I've sadly removed shrimp unless it's sustainable wild caught shrimp. And kind of helped inform my own decisions based on the work I've done. But I want to end by saying that, this has all been work motivated by the environment. And of course, there's all sorts of other reasons that people choose to eat what they do. They could be cultural reasons. They could be local food systems or food sovereignty reasons. That might, or animal welfare reasons, and all of these reasons are 100% legitimate reasons to make diet choices, and they don't always line up with the environmental footprint aspects of food production systems. And so you know, this is what I chose to base my diet decisions on. I hope this kind of information is useful and thinking about the way that you choose to eat the food you do, but no judgment if you change or you use other reasons. It's all important. So with that, happy to take questions. I can return to the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask the question that you had in there in person. But thank you so much for your time and interest.